So how's everybody doing today?
Peachy.
Peachy. It's good to be back here. Middle of August, and it's about that time of year where everybody's starting to watch the standings for baseball. So it seemed like kind of an appropriate time to talk a little bit about baseball history. Not so much the history of the game itself, however. What the talk today is going to look at are baseball stadiums, the fields, the parks in which baseball is played, and kind of how those structures, how those buildings changed over the course of the 20th century. How many of you have ever been to a baseball game? Where do you go? Where? Fenway.
Been to the new one. Well, it's not new anymore, but Baltimore got a beautiful stadium.
Down at Oriole Park.
I went to Tampa.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Terrible stadium.
Terrible teams. We'll talk about them a little bit later on too. But we've all kind of experienced a Major League Baseball field. And, you know, there's something almost magical about going through the grandstands and coming out and seeing that brilliant green when it's natural grass, not in Tampa. And kind of if you go on a sunny day, the bright blue sky and the crowds and the sound and the hot dogs and all of that. So we're going to look at the structures that go into this quintessentially American pastime. I've called this talk American Cathedrals, Baseball Ballparks and the Changing Shape of America's Cities. Because, as we'll see, as the idea of the baseball stadium changes over the course of the 20th century, it reflects many of the changes in American society. Can anybody name who that guy is right there? Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio, one of the great baseball players of the first half of the 20th century. We'll see Joe DiMaggio again in a couple of minutes. So, where do we begin? Baseball has been played in the United States in some form or another since at least the 1840s. There was New York rules baseball. There was Boston rules baseball. There was a game called Rounders. They all kind of were sort of like the thing we call baseball today. It really isn't until the Civil War, however, that you begin to see a real unification of the idea of baseball. It's during the Civil War, when troops from all over the country were sent to different places, that you begin to see a homogenization of the rules of baseball. The New York rules, bless you, start to dominate baseball. And it's after the Civil War that we begin to see really the growth of this thing that is called the national pastime. 19th century baseball was a little bit different than the modern game, what we're used to today. But we're going to pick up our story really in the early 20th century. And why the early 20th century? It's because that's when Major League Baseball, as we think of it today, really begins to form. We see the National League and the American leagues forming and eventually deciding to compete against each other in this event that is held in the autumn of each year that we today call the World Series. So pre-war baseball in the first half of the 20th century, that period before the Second World War, was limited geographically in scope. All of the professional teams in the United States were here in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest. The furthest west you ever went was St. Louis. And then as far south as you went was, I guess, Cincinnati or Washington, depending on which one you think is further south. It was all up in this area. There were cities that had two teams, such as Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and St. Louis. Cities that had one team. And, of course, in New York City, you had three teams. So you had this Major League professional baseball isolated in this upper corner of the country. But it's here where we see baseball begin to grow. And it was there among those teams that in 1903, the first World Series is held. The first World Series was waged between a team from Boston, the Boston Americans. They later changed their name to the Red Sox. And a team from Pittsburgh called the Pirates, the American League team and a National League team. This is a great picture, actually, of one of the games in Boston. And you see crowds all over the place. fans actually did stand in the outfield during the game. So imagine the drama and the excitement there. In any case, the first World Series is won by Boston. They win 5-3. The Boston team had a pretty celebrated pitcher who was one of their aces. His name was Cy Young, if anybody's heard of him. The Pittsburgh team did have their own superstars. They had a guy named Honus Wagner on their team, another one of the early stars of baseball. But in the end, Boston does win the first World Series. Now today we think of baseball games as being these affairs that last 3-4 hours. When the Yankees and Red Sox play, sometimes it's 5 or 6 hours. Most of these games were played in under 2 hours. So it was a very, very quick game. It was very much a pitching-heavy game. So Boston wins the first World Series. The ballpark that you see over here is the Huntington Avenue grounds, located on Huntington Avenue in Boston. And that was the home field of the Boston Americans and later the Boston Red Sox. It was a relatively small stadium, though, in terms of the number of people that could fit there. You only had the grandstands that wrapped around over here. These people are sitting on the outfield fences, and you had these crowds kind of lingering on the field of play itself. Well, what happens? The Boston Americans, Boston Red Sox gain popularity. More people want to see the game, so they decide we need to build a new stadium. And they look for a plot of land somewhere in Boston in which to build this new stadium. And they happen to find a place over by the railroad tracks in the Fenway district. So what happens? In 1912, Fenway Park is constructed. This is kind of what Fenway Park looks like today. Most of us are familiar with it. This is an earlier 20th century aerial picture of Fenway Park before the Mass Pike was run through here. So you can see Fenway Park, and if you've been to the park, it has weird angles, weird dimensions. Why? Because it was wedged into this property, this odd-shaped collection of land in the Fenway district. It's not surrounded by miles of parking. It's right in the heart of the city. You can walk to Fenway Park. You can take public transportation to Fenway Park. And that's very important. It's a very important part of the lure of the park itself. People like going to Fenway because it is right in the heart of the city. If you drive there, it's terrible. but if you're going to Fenway in any other way, it's a great place to see a baseball game. Fenway Park is the oldest stadium in Major League Baseball. It is 106 years old this season. So the Red Sox move into their brand new stadium and they are having lots of success. Lots of people are enjoying the Boston Red Sox. But there was another team in Boston at that time. Does anybody remember what the National League Boston team was?
Braves.
The Boston Braves. The Boston Braves, who played at the aptly named Braves Field. This was Braves Field. Now, Braves Field could hold about 40,000 people. So it was a big stadium, bigger than Fenway is today in terms of seating capacity. And it was located over on Commonwealth Ave, over today where Northeastern University is. In fact, Braves Field doesn't exist anymore, well, but some of the structures do. Some of the grandstands and the ticket building still exist as part of Northeastern University. When Northeastern had a football field, had a football team, they played over here at Nickerson Field, which was the remnants of Braves Field. This was a gigantic ballpark. It was some 500 feet to center field. So it's a long way to hit a ball. And oftentimes, in the early years before Fenway Park was constructed, when the Boston Americans or Boston Red Sox went to the World Series, they played their home World Series games here because it was a larger stadium, bigger seating capacity than Huntington Avenue. Yes?
You're referring to Northeastern, don't you mean Boston University?
Is it BU that's Nickerson Field? Yes, BU, excuse me, yes. Northeastern is over on Huntington Avenue. But yes, this would have been where BU is. Again, this here would have been the Mass Pike. And if you drive by the Mass Pike there, you can see there are dorms now in most of this area where Braves Field used to be. So the Braves were in Boston until 1952, when as we'll see later on, they moved. Where did the Braves move to when they left Boston? Milwaukee. They became the Milwaukee Braves. Eventually, the Braves moved from Milwaukee and end up in Atlanta, where they remain today. So we had the Braves over here. This stadium was built in 1915, and again, it is wedged into the surrounding area. It's bordered by train tracks on one side and streets and buildings on the other three sides. It was a stadium that fit into the space that was available in the middle of a busy urban center. Now, what we'll see as we move forward is that the period of the early 20th century, from about 1905 to about 1925, those 2 decades were a period of tremendous growth in popularity in baseball. And many teams begin to build new stadiums in which to play their games, new concrete and steel stadiums. The old 19th century ballparks were generally wooden structures. Wooden structures have some limits in what they can do. One, you can't build them too high or too big. Wood has structural limits. And two, wooden structures catch fire. So many teams in the first couple of decades of the 20th century begin building new, modern, for that time, stadiums. Like the team in Pittsburgh, the Pirates build Forbes Field. Much like we see at Fenway, Forbes Field was built right into the neighborhood. You can see the houses right here. It had this double grandstand, a steel superstructure. This is where the Pittsburgh Pirates played for 61 years. This was their home field. They played in this, what is called a jewel box type stadium. Fenway, Wrigley, Forbes Field were all called jewel box stadiums because they were small, they were intimate, and they were wedged into these urban neighborhoods. So this is probably a picture from about the 1950s of Forbes Field. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, 2 teams eventually will play in this baseball park. This is Shibe Park. It was built originally in 1909 as the home for the Philadelphia Athletics. And Shibe Park was in many ways a decorative structure. It was a ballpark with seating all around it, and it was decorated in an almost Romanesque Gothic sort of facade over here, famous for its tower right there at the corner entrance. Shibe Park was kind of a beloved stadium in Philadelphia. Generations of athletics fans went to see the games there, went to attend sporting events there. And if you look at the structure of it, what do you notice about the outfield? It's kind of diamond-shaped like the infield. You have this far center field over here that's very, very, very far away from home plate. A lot of these jewel box ball fields, though they were wedged into these urban spaces, though they were relatively small in capacity, had these giant fields because they were asymmetrical. They had weird angles. They had these tight corners. If you knew how to hit in one of those ballparks, you had a tremendous advantage. Again, if we look at Fenway Park today, Fenway Park has that weird triangle in center field where the bullpen kind of disappears off to the green monster, and there's a corner there that opposing outfielders get lost in. That is one of the kind of advantages for Red Sox home players, knowing how that field is laid out. You have the same thing over here. You have these large dimensions. Now, this era of baseball that we're looking at was sometimes called the dead ball era. The ball that was used is different than the modern ball. Today's modern balls are wound very, very tightly. They're very dense. You can hit a modern ball a long way. In the dead ball era, the ball didn't bounce off the bat the same way it does. The ball absorbed a lot of the force of the blow, didn't necessarily go out of the ballpark. You didn't see a lot of people hitting a lot of home runs during this time period. But there were a lot of runs scored. A lot of them were inside the park home runs. Now imagine you have 500 feet to dead straightaway center field. The guy hits the ball 495 feet. It bounces, rolls around in the corner. He's going around the bases on the inside the park home runs. It must have been a very exciting thing to see. Another thing about this era is that the balls that were used weren't taken out of play very often. They were used for the whole game, and they could get very dirty. The pitchers would scuff them, would spit on them, would get them all tobacco stained as a way of kind of doctoring the ball, and it was all allowed. It was allowed until an incident when a ball player occurred in Ebbets Field. A ball player named Roy Chapman, I believe, was struck in the head by a pitched ball that was probably really dirty, really scuffed, couldn't see it, hits him in the head, and he dies the next day. So after that, baseball started to crack down on dirty balls, started to crack down on scuffing the ball as a matter of player safety, batter safety. The dead ball era also comes to an end in the late 19-teens, early 1920s because of the rise of a single player, who we'll talk about later on, who kind of changes the way the game is played. In any case, the Philadelphia Athletics played in this ballpark from 1909 to 1954. The Phillies come in and they play from 1938 until 1970. This was there for a long time in Philadelphia. In Detroit, they build Grand Tiger Stadium. The Detroit Tigers were one of those legendary teams that were very, very popular in the upper Midwest. They were one of the only teams in that part of the country. And Tiger Stadium, again, built right into the neighborhood, built right into the confines of the city itself. What we're looking at here is a modified Tiger Stadium with a lot more seating added. As the game becomes more popular in the 1920s and the 1930s, the stadiums had to expand, and they expanded by adding more rows of seats, more upper decks all the way around. But the Detroit Tigers played at Tiger Stadium from 1912 to 1999. A good long run in that old ballpark. Imagine if you lived in one of these neighborhoods right here and you knew there was a ball game and you could just walk down the street and buy a ticket for a nickel and go sit in the bleachers and watch the Tigers. I don't think you can buy a ticket for a nickel anymore. In any case, again, an urban ballpark wedged right into the neighborhood. The owners buy up lots of the city and they build their stadium right there, easily accessible from the streets, from the city itself. One of the great players on the Tigers teams of that era was, of course, Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb is considered one of the top 3 baseball players of all time. He still has the highest career batting average of any baseball player. He hit about 367 over his playing career, and his playing career was 23 seasons. He actually had a streak of seasons in the middle of his playing career where he hit above 400 2 consecutive years, and then like 390 and 386 the following 2 years. Then he slumped down to like 360 in there, you know. But he was a phenomenal baseball player, a fierce competitor. This is a great action shot of Ty Cobb rounding the bases. He does still hold many records in Major League Baseball. We're talking 90 years after his playing career ended. He was in the group of the first inductees into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He went in with something like 96% of the vote to get into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So he was a truly, truly outstanding, legendary figure in early baseball. And in many ways, Tiger Stadium was built as a showcase for Ty Cobb. He was the guy in the outfield that everybody wanted to see on the Detroit Tigers. Does anybody know his nickname? He was from Georgia. He was called the Georgia Peach. Now, when we think of peaches, we think of like soft and sweet. Ty Cobb wasn't that. He was a very fierce competitor. There are some stories about how he used to sharpen his spikes so that when he slid into, second base or whatever, the second baseman would get out of the way or get spiked. It's legend. We don't know if that actually is true, but that's kind of the reputation that Ty Cobb had as a ball player. In Chicago, in the meantime, you had 2 teams that were vying for the attention of the Windy City. One was owned by a guy named Charles Comiskey. And Comiskey was Notoriously frugal in paying his players. That eventually leads to some scandal with the White Sox. But Comiskey did want to draw in crowds, so he builds in 1910 Comiskey Park. Modestly names it after himself. And this becomes the home park of the Chicago White Sox. Now, what is the scandal that becomes associated with the White Sox? 1919. The Black Sox Scandal. In 1919, the Chicago White Sox were a dominant team, and everybody expected them to easily win the World Series. But what happens? They throw it. There were gamblers from New York and Chicago and mobsters who essentially conspired to get the White Sox to lose the World Series. Several of the White Sox players took money from the gamblers, from the mobsters. Several of the pitchers didn't pitch great games. And in 1919, the Chicago White Sox are accused and eventually found, well, in trial, they were found not guilty, but they are later banned from baseball for conspiring to throw the World Series. It's probably the greatest scandal in baseball history. A good fictionalized account of the Black Sox scandal is the movie 8 Men Out. It kind of tells you a little bit about the personalities. One of the stars on that Chicago White Sox team was a guy named Shoeless Joe Jackson, who was, by many accounts, an equally skilled ball player to a guy like Ty Cobb. Could hit, could run, could throw. But because he was associated with the White Sox in 1919, because his name is tied to that scandal, he is forever banned from baseball. He never played professional baseball again, not in the Hall of Fame, even though he probably had the skill set to make it there. Probably was not involved in the gambling aspect of that either, but is brought down because the entire team was tainted by that scandal. In any case, Comiskey Park is where a lot of that took place, named after Comiskey. Now, why would the ball players in the Black Sox scandal want to take money from gamblers or from mobsters? Because they felt they weren't getting their due from Comiskey. He was penny pitching and, like as I said, didn't like to pay his players. So Comiskey Park is one of the ballparks in Chicago. What's the other one? Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field was built in 1914 and still in use today. Wrigley Field is almost legendary in baseball. When we think of Wrigley, you think of maybe the red marquee here in front or the ivy-covered walls in the outfield. Wrigley, or the gum. Well, why is it named Wrigley Field? Named after the gum company. The Wrigley family owned the team, built the stadium, named it after themselves. So you have Wrigley Field. Like Fenway, like Comiskey, like those other early jewel box stadiums, Wrigley Field is built right in the middle of a neighborhood. In fact, even today, these houses across the street put up bleachers on their roofs and sell seats there so that people can watch the games. It is very much a fabric of the Wrigleyville neighborhood of Chicago. The Cubs, of course, had a long stretch of terrible success, terrible failure in Wrigley Field. They won the World Series in 1908 and then didn't win it again until like 2 years ago, wasn't it? 2016 or something like that. It's a worse stretch than the Red Sox had. So Wrigley was the place where all of those hopes and dreams of generations of Chicago Cubs fans disappeared. Yet it was also the place recently of tremendous joy for those Cubbies. But Wrigley, another one of those jewel boxes built right into the fabric of the neighborhood, an integral part of this area of Chicago. And that brings us to New York, which some people have referred to as the capital of baseball. In the first half of the 20th century, New York had 3 teams that were prosperous, that were popular, and that eventually become dominant. You had the New York Giants, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and of course, the New York Yankees. This is a great view to kind of show you the prominence of baseball in New York. This is from about 1930, Yankee Stadium here in the foreground. And back here, across the Harlem River in Upper Manhattan, about a quarter mile away, the Polo Grounds, where the New York Giants played. These two ballparks were right next to each other. Now, the story of why they're so close to each other has to do with the owner of the New York Giants and the success of the New York Yankees. The Yankees, when they first come up, were called the New York Highlanders, eventually become the New York Yankees. They start having tremendous success in winning baseball games. They become very, very popular in New York City, but they didn't have their own stadium. They were renting the Polo Grounds. So the Yankees would play on one day, the Giants would play on the other. The problem that started to happen by the early 1920s is that the Yankees started to outdraw the Giants. There were more Yankees fans showing up for games at the Polo Grounds than there were Giants fans showing up at the Polo Grounds. And eventually the owner of the Giants evicted the Yankees, kicked them out. Now, why were the Yankees becoming so popular around 1918, 1919, 1920? Because of really one singular player, a guy named Babe Ruth. And what's the legend with Babe Ruth here in the Boston area? The curse of the Bambino. The reason why the Red Sox go from 1918 to 2004 without winning a World Series is because in 1919, Babe Ruth was sold by the owner of the Red Sox to the New York Yankees. And supposedly on his way out of town, he left a curse on the Red Sox. Now, the story of why Babe Ruth was sold was so that the owner of the Red Sox, Henry Frazee, could finance his girlfriend's Broadway play, No No Nanette. It is a legend that really wasn't why Babe Ruth was sold, but the fact that Babe Ruth went from Boston, where he was a dominant pitcher, to New York, where he becomes the kind of face of baseball in the modern game, is a significant story in early baseball. So here we have these two ballparks. Here's a look at the inside of the Polo Grounds in northern Manhattan, the home of the New York Giants. It was built, this version of the Polo Grounds, which is actually the fourth stadium to have this name, was built in 1911. And it was a weird looking ballpark. We actually go back to this image over here. It's kind of like a giant elongated U. So it was round at one end, straight out the other two ends. And that meant that it had weird angles. If you look over here to deep left center or right center or straightaway center field, you have this vast amount of outfield. The right and left field lines relatively short. But you had all of this space in the outfield, which meant that oftentimes you'd have a lot of extra base hits. You'd have a lot of inside the park home runs because there was a lot of territory for those outfielders to cover. At one point, this end was largely open. And you could look out from home plate out across the Harlem River, and what would you see over there in the distance, a quarter mile away? But Yankee Stadium. And the success of the Yankees, of course, drove the Giants crazy, so they eventually start adding more bleachers and billboards and scoreboards out here to obscure the view of Yankee Stadium across the river. So this is where the Giants played for 46 years until the 1957 season. Over in Brooklyn, another New York team, the Brooklyn Dodgers, played many of their games at Ebbets Field. Ebbets Field was, again, wedged into a neighborhood. You can see surrounded by blocks, apartment buildings all around it. It was very much a fabric of Brooklyn, a part of the fabric of Brooklyn, and it was designed on the outside to be celebratory. Had arches and columns, a brick facade over here. The field of play on the interior had those crazy angles because, again, it was wedged into that constricted piece of land. For the better part of half a century, the Brooklyn Dodgers played here at this ballpark. It became their sentimental home. It was the site of tremendous postseason failures and a few moments of postseason glory. When the Dodgers finally win the World Series in the early 1950s, it was a tremendous moment of pride for Brooklyn and for the team. This, again, is another of those early ballparks that was meant to connect the city with the team, with the ball players. It was a part of the neighborhood. Why is the team called the Dodgers, by the way? Does anybody know where they got that name? The legend is because in Brooklyn there were lots of streetcars. People were always dodging the streetcars. So Brooklyn became known as the neighborhood of the Dodgers. The ball team took that name because they were dodging the streetcars. So we've looked at the Polo Grounds, we looked at Shibe Field, and that brings us to really the grandest of the New York ballparks, Yankee Stadium. Despite what you think of the Yankees, how you feel about them personally, I grew up as a Yankees fan. Yankee Stadium was a tremendous place to go to a baseball game. This is a picture from the early 1930s, before they actually extended the third deck all the way around over here to the front. Sometimes called the house that Ruth built, because it was built basically because of the influence of Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth became such a sensation, such an attraction for the New York Yankees. His hitting prowess, his fielding skill made Babe Ruth the most important baseball player of his era, and really probably of the 20th century. And it's Babe Ruth's success, Babe Ruth's fame and popularity that got the Yankees kicked out of Ebbets Field, caused them to build this stadium that they moved into in 1923. Who hits the first home run in Yankee Stadium? Babe Ruth. So very much the house that Ruth built. The Yankees would play in this stadium for 75 years. 85 years, let me do my math. Until 2008, when they moved to a new stadium that was built right next door over here. And we'll look at that later on. So you have Yankee Stadium, becomes known as the Cathedral of Baseball. Of course, the Yankees do become the most successful team in baseball history. With their postseason appearances and the number of championships, this becomes really a celebration of baseball excellence at Yankee Stadium. Perhaps one of the most celebrated of the Yankees teams was the Murderers Row team, the 1927 team. Here's Babe Ruth. This guy over here, he wasn't a bad player either. His name was Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig, of course, famous for playing in some 2,000-something consecutive games, a record that wasn't broken until the 1990s when Cal Ripken Jr. finally eclipsed it. Lou Gehrig also had the highest number of hits for a Yankee until Derek Jeter broke that record maybe 5 years ago. So outstanding players that carried the Murderers Row team. They had a win-loss record of 110 wins to 44 losses, which was a 71% winning percentage. Kind of unheard of. They totally dominated baseball in that era, really one of the great teams in baseball history. So baseball, prior to the Second World War, was a national game, but the professional aspect of it was contained in the Northeast, from Chicago to Boston and New York, in that area. And really, 1941, which was the last pre-war baseball season, would be one of the great memorable baseball seasons because of the accomplishments really of two extraordinary players. Ted Williams, Boston Red Sox, and Joe DiMaggio, the New York Yankees. Williams, in that season of 1941, hits .406 for the year. He is the last man to ever hit 400 in a baseball season. DiMaggio had a 56-game hitting streak in the middle of the season. That is a nearly impossible task to fathom. I think the most recent long hitting streak was somewhere in the 40s. So you have a ways to go before you catch Joe DiMaggio. Many people believe that DiMaggio's record won't be caught. It's almost impossible to be that consistent. Actually, the day he lost that streak. He obviously didn't get hit in that game, but the next 9 games after that, he hit safely in. So had he gotten a hit in that game, the record would have been further out of reach. In any case, 1941, you have these two giants of the game and these tremendous accomplishments. Incidentally, who wins the MVP award in 1941?
Williams.
It wasn't Williams, it was DiMaggio. Because of the hit streak, yeah.
I think the 406 averages.
The 406 is incredible. But
I don't think either one will ever be broken, but I think
it would be
it's about a 50-50 split today on
which is harder to do.
Yeah.
There have been, like in the last decade or so, there have been a few people that have flirted with 400.
Williams himself hit 388 in probably 2 or 3 years before he retired.
Right. Well, the thing about Ted Williams, when you consider his career, is that he went and fought in the Second World War and then went and fought in the Korean War. He lost 5 years of his prime fighting.
Only 2 major league players were recalled to Korea. Williams was one. Who was the other? Joe Coleman, second baseman.
Really?
I think he's still alive.
He might be.
He was a broadcaster for the Padres for about 30 years.
The thing about Williams is he went and was a pilot, a fighter pilot. And
High school grad.
you have to consider a guy with his hand-eye coordination would make an excellent fighter pilot, and in fact, he did. So he serves 2 stints in the military, fighting for this country, comes back, continues his baseball career. Ted Williams is widely considered one of the greatest hitters, if not the greatest hitter in baseball history, because of his skill at the plate. In any case, these 2 guys, they were the icons of 1940s era baseball. You could probably throw Stan Musial in there from the Cardinals, St. Louis Cardinals, exactly. And they were the big 3 of the era. All 3 of them went and fought in the Second World War. And that brings us to post-war baseball, part 2. What happens in the aftermath of the Second World War? We have all of these jewel box stadiums all over the place, but baseball's popularity is continuing to grow. It's growing because it's broadcast on the radios. It's growing because of newsreels. But there's a problem. Baseball is concentrated in one part of the country. What about the other 75% of the United States? What's happening there? Where is baseball going there? Well, there are 2 important developments in baseball after the Second World War. The first reflects changes that are going on in the country, and it had to do with integration. Baseball was segregated. You had the major leagues and you had the Negro leagues. And in the Negro leagues, you had fantastic ball players, but they weren't allowed to play in the major leagues until 1947. When the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, a guy named Branch Rickey, decided to force the integration of baseball. And he looked in the Negro Leagues and found a player who he thought not only had the skill to play in Major League Baseball, but had the temperament to withstand the abuse that he was inevitably going to face. That guy was Jackie Robinson. On April 15th, 1947, Jackie Robinson makes his Major League debut, integrating baseball. That would begin a mass movement from the Negro Leagues into Major League Baseball. Many skilled, prominent players do eventually make their way into Major League Baseball and become stars, all-stars, legends of the game in the major leagues. Jackie Robinson, of course, is the first. Now, what was the last team in Major League Baseball to integrate?
Red Sox.
The Boston Red Sox. There's some controversy about that in the lore of the Red Sox and Tom Yawkey and his attitudes and that sort of thing. But we do see this process of integration beginning in 1947. I think the Red Sox finally do have an African-American player in the early 1950s. I can't remember what year it was. Pumpsy Green, 52 or 53, I want to say, but I could be wrong on the date. But we begin to see integration, reflecting social change in the United States. In World War II, the Army was segregated. After World War II, it is eventually integrated. So we see parallels between society and baseball occurring here. And what was the other monumental change that occurs in baseball after the war? Westward migration. Teams in the West, in California. California was growing in population. People were beginning to move out of the urban centers in the Northeast and the industrial centers in the Midwest, moving to the South, moving to the West. But baseball was still relegated up over here. So what happens? In the 1950s, 2 of the 3 New York teams decide to move. They decide to take advantage of fertile territory in the West, get away from the dominance of the Yankees in New York City, and migrate. Following the 1957 season, both the Dodgers and the Giants leave New York. The Dodgers, of course, go to Los Angeles. They play a few seasons at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. The Giants go to San Francisco. And just like that, in 1958, you have California baseball. You now have teams on the far West Coast. Now, there was another reason why Major League Baseball wanted to get teams out into California, and it had to do with the Pacific Coast League, a minor league league in California that was thinking of trying to elevate itself to the major league level. There would have been economic competition from a Western professional baseball league. So the major league teams in the East decide to take advantage of the markets there. When the Dodgers eventually get their own stadium, they build it on the outskirts of downtown Los Angeles in an area called Chavez Ravine. They build what comes to be called Dodger Stadium. Now, Chavez Ravine had a long history. People had lived there for many years. It was primarily a Latin American neighborhood. When the city planners in Los Angeles said we need to put a baseball stadium somewhere, where are we going to build it? Well, why don't we evict these people over here and use that as the location for building Dodger Stadium. So Dodger Stadium is supposedly a wonderful place to watch a game. Never been there. It's in a dramatic setting. There are cliffs and palm trees and stuff like that. It's surrounded by vast swaths of parking lot because California, car culture, you drive everywhere. But the kind of backstory is that an entire neighborhood had to be evicted, had to be removed in order to build Dodger Stadium. Meanwhile, up in San Francisco, the Giants begin building their own stadium right next to San Francisco Bay. A stadium that eventually is called Candlestick Park. Here's an early view of Candlestick Park. You can see the grandstand seating kind of going halfway around here in 1962, 63. Acres of parking and then the bay beyond it. Candlestick Park was designed to be a dual-use stadium. It was not only going to be the home of the San Francisco Giants, the baseball team, it was also going to be used as a football stadium and the home of the San Francisco 49ers. So it was designed to be a multi-use facility. It was pioneering in this in many ways. Football games had been played at Yankee Stadium, football games had been played at the Polo Grounds and even at Fenway Park, but they were not designed primarily for that. They were designed for baseball stadiums. Candlestick Park had both things in mind. In fact, when it was configured for football, there were a set of bleachers that were put over here in right field to cover the field to kind of give you the football field shape. Eventually, the stadium is enclosed all the way around with an upper deck, and it would be the home of the San Francisco Giants from 1960 to 1999. The 49ers played there until about 3 seasons ago. So it was still in use as a football stadium until the early 21st century. As teams began to move west and as population centers began to shift, Major League Baseball begins a process of expansion. We begin to see teams moving south, moving west. Eventually, California ends up with 5 baseball teams. There are teams scattered throughout the middle of the country. 2 end up in Texas. The Kansas City Royals are established. Now, the story of the Royals is that originally the Philadelphia Athletics were unhappy in Philadelphia. They want to move. They first attempt to move to Kansas City, but then decide to settle over here on the San Francisco Bay and Oakland and become the Oakland A's. So Kansas City's eventually awarded a team that becomes the Kansas City Royals. Now, in the Negro Leagues, there was a Kansas City team that was a dominant team called the Kansas City Monarchs. So the name the Royals kind of pays tribute to that team from the Negro Leagues. You see a team established here in Milwaukee after the Braves decide to go south to Atlanta. You get Milwaukee there. The team in Washington that had been the Senators moves to Montreal, and then, actually they don't move to Montreal, but the Senators disappears. A team is established in Montreal, the Montreal Expos. When the Expos fold, they go to Washington, it becomes the Washington Nationals. That's the team that's there today. But we see this spread of baseball across the country, even up here in Seattle, out here in the middle in Colorado. In the years after the Second World War, after baseball spreads to California, it begins to spread across the country, following those population shifts into the Sun Belt states. And as new teams are established, new stadiums are built. Perhaps one of the most groundbreaking of those baseball stadiums was the one built in Houston, the Astrodome. The Astrodome, when it was built, was an engineering wonder. It was the first fully enclosed domed athletic stadium. And it is actually one of the largest domes, one of the widest domes built since Roman times. So you're talking 2,000 years of history. This is one of the widest domes. It was sometimes referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. It's where the Houston Astros played. The Houston football team, whatever name it was at any time, played there. There were boxing matches that were held there. There were basketball games held there. It also introduced one terrible innovation: AstroTurf. When the Astrodome was first built, they tried growing grass in here. But the grass doesn't grow without sunlight. So they turned to an artificial turf, an artificial surface that took the name AstroTurf after the stadium in which it was in. AstroTurf will, to baseball purists, become a plague on the game. It starts popping up all over the place. Because it was durable, it was easy to maintain, but it was also terrible to play on because it was essentially a carpet on top of concrete. Players got hurt, the ball was very lively when it bounced off the AstroTurf, but it is an innovation that became very significant in not only baseball but other sports. In football, they played on AstroTurf, and eventually there are other generations of artificial turf and field turf that come along, but this is where it begins, here at the Astrodome. Is that thunder? At the same time that the Astrodome and AstroTurf are starting to spread and gain prominence, other cities that are being awarded new baseball teams begin to build domed structures. Seattle builds the Kingdome, which becomes the home of the Seattle Mariners. It's basically this domed concrete monstrosity, field of AstroTurf. Look at the setting where this is. You have mountains in the background, and still you can't see them because you're in this dome. In Minneapolis, where they had a long history of baseball, in the early 1980s, they built the Metrodome. It's the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, named after a favorite son of Minnesota. That was, in many ways, an innovation in dome construction. Whereas the Astrodome and the Kingdome had rigid dome roofs, this one was a flexible dome roof that was inflated. It was essentially a giant balloon. And it was an air that held the dome up and in place. Famously, in the early 2000s, after a heavy snowstorm, the roof got a hole in it, and the entire thing just collapsed. And they had to repair the roof. So this is the first roof on the Astrodome. There was a later roof that was added. The Twins played in the Astrodome until 2009. The Metrodome until 2009. So you had these type of dome stadiums. Also becoming popular, however, in this period of the 1960s and 1970s were the multi-purpose stadiums. The ones that were built to house not only baseball teams, but football teams. Now, it sounds like a great idea, but baseball and football are played on two very differently shaped fields and have very different conditions for spectators. Yet, many municipalities during this time period invested heavily in these concrete circles to house their major league teams. Practical, probably. Ugly, certainly. The multi-purpose stadiums were not a high point of artistic design for athletic venues. This used to be the old Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. It's since changed its name to Synergy Field. A couple of other somewhat infamous, the Vet in Philadelphia, Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh, a giant concrete circle. Some have likened it to a toilet bowl, with an AstroTurf field thrown down, or perhaps most notoriously, the Vet in Philadelphia. Philadelphians tend to be nostalgic about their sports teams. They tend to like their sports venues. When the Vet was torn down in 2003, nobody cried. That's how terrible a venue it was. So they went from playing in Shibe Field, the Phillies, that beautiful structure with a nice ornate tower, to playing in a concrete cylinder that was shared between a baseball team and a football team, playing on AstroTurf instead of natural grass. Perhaps one of the reasons why Philadelphia went decades without winning a major league championship had to do with the venue in which they were playing. So you had these AstroTurf fields, and for decades, that was the status of baseball stadiums. You had the old stadiums that were still being maintained, the Comiskey Parks, the Yankee Stadiums, the Fenways. You had these West Coast stadiums that had been built after the war, and then you had these relics of the 60s and 70s. It really isn't until we get to the late 1980s that we begin to see a change and an innovation in baseball stadium design. And one of the really groundbreaking examples of that, one of the groundbreaking ideas, was built in Toronto. Originally called the SkyDome. Today it's known as the Rogers Center. This was a tremendous innovation in baseball design when it was built. The amazing thing about the SkyDome was that it had a retractable roof. In inclement weather, the roof would come out and cover the field. When it was sunny, it would retract back. Here you see the roof open. It was considered groundbreaking. It was considered innovative. Many people thought that this was the future of baseball and sports stadiums. Well, not so much baseball stadiums chose to go this way. Many football stadiums, however, do eventually adopt this retractable roof idea. One of the problems with SkyDome, despite that innovative roof design, was that it was essentially still a large concrete bowl. It still had that idea of a multi-purpose stadium, and it was still AstroTurf on the interior. But you do now have this technological structural innovation of having these retractable roofs. This was opened in 1989, and as I said, was groundbreaking at the time. People thought it was revolutionary at the time. But it fell prey to a change of idea in what a baseball stadium should be. And that brings us to the last part of the discussion, the modern era. The baseball stadiums that were built starting after SkyDome, starting after the 1990s. One of the first and most important of these was Oriole Park at Camden Yard, which opened in 1992. Now, what was it that made Oriole Park such a fantastic ballpark? Well, first of all, the Orioles had been playing in one of those old concrete bowls, Municipal Stadium, Memorial Stadium, one of those types of stadiums in Baltimore. And it was not really a good setting for baseball. So the Orioles built a new stadium that looked backward to baseball history for its design inspiration, for its structure. If you look at Oriole Park at Camden Yard, popularly known as Camden Yards, it is a brick facade and a steel and concrete interior, painted this kind of rustic color of green, nostalgic green. You're integrating it into the neighborhood, into the area of the city in the Inner Harbor. Along the outfield, you have the famous warehouse over here. It became a model for how to build a retro classic ballpark. It was modern in its structure, modern in its innovations, but still looked back to baseball history for its inspiration. The success and popularity of Camden Yard would inspire other baseball teams, baseball cities, to build their own retro classic baseball stadiums. We see this in Cleveland when Jacob Field is opened in 1994. In Cleveland, the Indians had for decades played in a concrete bowl, kind of soulless. Now we are building a baseball-specific stadium in Cleveland, and it was a retro classic stadium with modern touches, sometimes referred to as modern retro classic. While the design, the angles, the integration into the neighborhood all harken back to an earlier period in baseball, there are architectural details along the top, large glass walls, interesting ironwork that lend it a modern touch. This builds on what had been established by Camden Yards and pushes baseball stadium design forward into the middle of the 1990s. And we see this continued effort at building a jewel of a ballpark. Many teams do decide to go back and look at baseball history as their inspiration. The two new baseball stadiums that were built in New York in the early 2000s, Citi Field, where the New York Mets play, which was based on the design of Ebbett Field. You can see by the facade there. And the new Yankee Stadium, which was modeled after the old Yankee Stadium, which was right next door to it. These were retro classic baseball stadiums, but with modern ideas, with modern elements thrown in. There were some teams that building new stadiums went in an entirely different direction. The Miami Marlins Stadium in Miami decided to build basically an Art Deco type stadium to reflect the environment of Miami, to reflect the building style in Miami. The Tampa Bay team built a dome and play on AstroTurf. But, you know, that's what you get. The team in Texas, the Texas Rangers, their stadium in Arlington, which opened in 1994, is another one of those retro classic, made to look like an old style ballpark. They've played in that for about 25 years now. They're building a new stadium in Arlington to replace that old stadium, which really isn't that old. But, you know, baseball teams, baseball stadium design continues to innovate, hearkening back to the past, but also innovating for modern design. We see a lot of stadiums that have retractable roofs now. You know, you don't play baseball in the rain, but if you have a roof that can cover, you can play baseball. But trying to incorporate some aspects of the history of the game. This is a map of stadiums in the major leagues. Here's Fenway Park, the oldest stadium in baseball, going out to the Rays over here in the Tropicana Field, I think it's called. Miami Marlins over here. The Astros are building their stadium with a retractable roof. So baseball design and the shape of baseball stadiums has always been a point of contention among baseball purists. There are those who like the jewel box design, the Fenway Parks, the Wrigley Fields, the old school baseball stadiums. There were those who pushed for innovation in the middle of the century to build those multi-use structures, kind of reflecting changes in American urban society. Many of those multi-use stadiums weren't in the downtown areas, weren't easily accessible by foot or public transportation. They were surrounded by miles of parking lots because people took their cars and drove to the games rather than being able to walk down to the baseball field. But what we see coming after that in the 1990s is a reaction to that kind of isolation of the ball fields, that reaction to the lack of design in those concrete cylinders. And we begin to see almost a nostalgia for the old school, old style baseball fields, incorporating them in the cities, making them accessible and looking at traditional baseball stadium design. So as baseball has evolved, as baseball stadiums have evolved, you see in that a reflection in many ways of American society. Changes in urban society, changes in race politics in the United States. All of that is eventually reflected in the national pastime, in the game of baseball, and in the arenas in which baseball is played. So does anybody have any questions about baseball stadiums?
Just a comment. We went to Arlington some years ago, and the thing that impressed us most of all was free parking.
Free parking, but lots of it.
Yeah.
I think, going back to Joe D. and Ted, a lot of people overlook the fact that he hit .406. He got 6 hits and 8 at bats.
In the last game of the season, yep.
At Shibe Park in Philly. But I think one thing we overlooked with Ted's lifetime average, which was 344, he played in an era where there was no such thing as a sacrifice fly. And I've seen many baseball writers say to his lifetime average, which is 344, add between 5 and 8 points.
That's
because of he hit all these fly balls.
that scored
tags
runs.
Up and scores.
Right.
But that's an at bat where
Today it's not.
today it's not.
The way baseball statistics have been compiled and figured has changed over time. And in fact, if you look at baseball statistics today, there are all different sorts of metrics that can be measured. But even the most basic things like batting average changes when you consider what's considered an at-bat versus a plate appearance. That time, everything was an at-bat. Today, sacrifice flies are not considered at-bats. There are other things that aren't considered at-bats, and that does play into the numbers. When I showed Ty Cobb's average, his career average, many people think that that would be significantly higher because of the number of sacrifice flies and other things that we don't count today that would have been averaged in his at-bats in his...
The real bogus number is the thing for saves today is ridiculous.
The way that the records are kept now is you have to think in 1912 you didn't have relievers. The guy who started the game generally finished the game. And it was not unusual for pitchers to pitch or to win, or there had been pitchers who won 30 games a season. Now most starters don't even start 30 games a season. So
nobody since Denny McLean in '68, and in that year he not only won I think 31 games, but he had something like 26 complete games, 9 innings.
And you think of that today.
Newcomb did it too.
Who pitches complete games today? It's the nature of the game has changed.
Actually, Porcello last week.
It's very rare though. I mean, it's newsworthy when a pitcher goes 9 innings, right?
First hit's a home run.
But it's the way that baseball is played has shifted away from pitching toward hitting. It's offense that has become kind of the sexy thing of baseball. It's the thing that sells tickets. People go to see home runs. They don't necessarily go to see a well-pitched one-run game. Personally, if I went to a game and it was a no-hitter, and the game was over in 2 hours, that'd be awesome. But people want to go and see, bombs being hit over the left field wall or whatever, which is also entertaining, but it's not. It's different than how baseball was played. You guys know who these two are? Mickey Mantle. And how about this one? Number 20. Willie Mays. Say hey kid. Perhaps one of the top 3 baseball players of all time, Willie Mays.
Still alive?
Still alive.
I agree.
Imagine if the kind of money Willie Mays would be making if he played today.
Still alive, too.
He is still alive. I mean, today you get pitchers who pitch, who win 10 games making $20 million a year. So, But that's a different conversation for a different time. Anyway, so that was baseball stadiums. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Presentation.